Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, intended to endure Marshall and the Court. The title was inspired by Marshall's words in 1819 for the decision McCulloch versus Maryland. He wrote, in part, "The provision is made in a constitution intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to various crises of human affairs." I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia, and in a moment it'll be my pleasure to introduce Paul Dinig from the DACOR Bacon House, our partners in today's presentation. Both of our organizations share the extraordinary and enduring legacies of John Marshall's life and his tenure as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, through the preservation of buildings and through the interpretation of artifacts that give us a glimpse into his life as jurist, citizen, soldier, statesman, neighbor, and family man. Preservation Virginia is the nation's first statewide nonprofit preservation organization. Our founders' goals were to save threatened historic places and ensure their preservation. In 1911, when the Marshall's Richmond home was threatened with demolition to build a high school in his honor, members of our organization rallied people across this nation to save the house and collect the furnishings to honor and interpret his legacy. We've been stewards of that home ever since. Since our founding, now almost 132 years ago, we've saved more than 400 historic places of memory across the Commonwealth, including 5 other historic sites that we open to the public: Cape Henry Lighthouse, Bacon's Castle, Smith Fort, Patrick Henry Scotchtown, and historic Jamestown. We advocate for policies and promote models that adapt and reuse historic fabric, protect archaeological sites and historic view sheds, and to fund these studies studies that ensure historic preservation, historic places are recognized for their economic, educational, and cultural impact. And we accomplish this work through the generosity of people like you. Thank you. We believe that there is no substitute for standing at the place where history happens. It may be as simple as walking through the streets of a historic downtown, standing on the edge of a river unencumbered by development, and seeing it as indigenous people once did, or walking into a humble dwelling where enslaved people returned to create a life separate from their servitude. Structures, landscapes, and archaeological sites give context to our history that may be inspiring, sobering, and troubling. Preservation efforts must strive to capture the complexities of our history and should seek ways to preserve these places and their stories for generations to come. So let's try a little experiment. If you look at your screen down at the bottom, there's a chat box. And I'd love for you to type in a historic place that means something to you. Go ahead, don't be shy. Okay. Ah, there we go. Robert Mills Stone Bridge. That's great. Danville. Somebody is after my heart. Thank you, Deborah. Tobacco Barns in the John Marshall House. The Lincoln Memorial. Jamestown. Gunston Hall. Well, I feel certain after you are listened to our remarkable panelists today, the John Marshall House and the DACOR Bacon House will be added to your list if it's not already there. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Dinig. In 2019, Mr. Dinig was named as president of the DACOR Bacon House Foundation after a career in public service that included 25 years in the Foreign Service at the State Department, and then leading the Office of U.S. Speaker and Specialist Programs in the Civil Service. Mr. Dinig.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is, as Elizabeth said, Paul Dennig, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this joint program on behalf of DACOR. We are thoroughly delighted at the collaboration we're able to have with Preservation Virginia, an organization of which I myself am also a member. And we do share some very important goals together. DACOR itself is an organization of foreign affairs professionals. We foster service, learning, community, and camaraderie. And we support diplomacy, the foreign service, and public understanding of diplomacy. Last, but certainly not least, we work very hard to preserve the 1825 federal-style historic DACOR Bacon House, located only 2 blocks from the White House. And you'll be hearing much more about the house later in the program. So thank you very much for joining us, and I now pass it on to Mika.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our program today. My name is Mika Downey, and I am the Education Manager at the John Marshall House in Richmond. Today's program, intended to endure Marshall and the Court, will last 90 minutes. In just a few minutes, we will hear from both of our speakers, followed by a Q&A from the audience and closing remarks. Q&A is a time for our speakers to interact directly with you tuning in at home. During the program, we invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A chat box on your screen. We will monitor the chat box throughout the program and select questions for our panelists to consider. We will try to get to as many questions as our time will allow today. Our 2 speakers are Jennifer Hurst-Wender and Angela Dickey, and let me now introduce them. Jennifer Hurst-Wender joined Preservation Virginia in August of 2008 and served as the statewide education coordinator until 2011, when she became the Associate Director of Museum Operations and Education, and in 2013 was named Director of Museum Operations and Education. She is responsible for the interpretation, preservation, and general operation details of Preservation Virginia's portfolio of 9 properties, 6 of which are open to the public. They include Patrick Henry's Scotchtown, the John Marshall House, Bacon's Castle, Smith's Fort, Jamestown, and Cape Henry Lighthouse. Jennifer previously served as the Education and Special Events Coordinator for the Hampton Roads Naval Museum and the World War II battleship, the USS Wisconsin. With a BA in History from Virginia Commonwealth University and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of the Arts, she's also worked with the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Atwater Kent Museum of Philadelphia History, the UPenn Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, the Mutter Museum, the Betsy Ross House, and the Independence Seaport Museum in Richmond, Virginia's House, and Agecroft Hall. Angela Dickey has served since 2015, first as Assistant Secretary and then as Secretary of the Boards of Governors and Trustees of DACOR and DACOR Bacon House Foundation, respectively. As Chair of DACOR's Task Force 2025, she leads an effort to commemorate through special programs and activities the bicentennial of DACOR's Bacon House. Angela also served on the board of directors of the Slave Dwelling Project, a small South Carolina nonprofit devoted to changing the narrative about slavery in the United States. Angela served from 2013 to 2015 as Secretary of the Board of the American Foreign Service Association. She was a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State from 1988 to 2013. During her career, she was posted to Canada, Mauritania, Yemen, Vietnam, and Laos. She also studied Arabic in Tunisia for a year. At the Department of State, she served variously as Iraq Desk Officer, Philippines Desk Officer, and Office Director for Maritime Southeast Asia. She was a fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Angela worked in the publishing and newspaper fields. She earned a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University and a master's in journalism from the University of Maryland, a graduate certificate in conflict transformation from Eastern Mennonite University, and a bachelor's degree in French and political science from Berry College in Rome, Georgia. I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and I will now pass it over to Jen, who is going to begin with the discussion about the John Marshall House.
Thank you, Mika. I really appreciate that introduction. And I am going to do a screen share and pull up a PowerPoint. All right. So I wanted to start with more thank yous. So working with the DACOR Bacon House, working with Angela Dickey, and all of the wonderful staff that are a part of the DACOR Bacon House has been a true pleasure. They've all helped put this program together. I'd also like to thank our Mika Downey, Preservation Virginia's John Marshall House's education manager. She's not only been an excellent moderator, but she at the Marshall House has been helping us develop K through 12 digital education programming for many students who cannot currently visit the Marshall House, but still want to have a wonderful civics education opportunity. So thank you to Mika for doing that. And thank you to everybody that has tuned in during your lunchtime to spend it with us on this program. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I wanted to mention, just as our CEO Elizabeth did, that the quote for this, this program, Intended to Endure, came from the 1819 McCulloch v. Maryland quote. And so as Elizabeth mentioned, the Constitution, the quote fully goes, the Constitution is intended to endure for ages to come and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. Now this famous bank case was one of the very many that, that was pretty unpopular at the time. And when John Marshall wrote the decision on this case, it basically strengthened the power of the federal government over the states. Now, one of John Marshall's biographers, Albert, Beveridge, wrote that the Chief Justice made the Constitution a living thing, capable of growth, capable of keeping pace with the advancement of the American people and ministering to their changing necessities. And so Intended to Endure is intended not specifically to talk just about the Supreme Court, which I think these quotes reflected the continuation of that quote to today, but also the fact that these two places that we're representing, the John Marshall House and also the DACOR Bacon House, have endured through the preservation and the advocacy from those of us who are listening into this program and those of us who have similar ideals. And so with that, I'm going to return to the Richmond house that John Marshall and his family lived in. Now they had this house built in 1790, and this circa 1890 photograph shows the house very similarly to what it looked like when John Marshall's granddaughters decided to sell it to the city of Richmond. So John Marshall had this house built in 1790. He lived here with his family until 1835 when he passed away, and passed to his daughter and then to his granddaughters. And in 1909, the city of Richmond purchased it from the granddaughters with the intention of tearing it down in order to build John Marshall High School in its place. Now, thankfully, there was a very vocal outcry at the time, and that didn't happen. The high school was built just about 15 feet on two sides of the house, the sides that aren't street, but the house remained. And then in the 1950s, the John Marshall High School was torn down and John Marshall Courts building was built in its place. The house still endures. You can see there it is in modern times. In 2005, on John Marshall's 250th birthday, the city of Richmond deeded Preservation Virginia, gave the deed to this house to Preservation Virginia. And so our 107 years of opening this house to the public has allowed us to preserve not only a lot of the architecture of this house, but also a lot of the objects. So if you have the opportunity to come and visit, you'll see just under half of the objects that are in the John Marshall House belong to John Marshall and his family. Now, one of my very favorite objects that are in this house, we happen to have the Supreme Court robe that belonged to John Marshall. So you can see it in this lithograph. It's a black silk robe. And to me, it's the most influential object of Marshall's time on the Supreme Court. And I think it really stands up to be of national significance. So the story goes is that it was John Marshall who first standardized the wearing of a black robe for Supreme Court justices. So when he was sworn in as the 4th Chief Justice of the United States in February 4th, 1801, he chose to wear a plain black robe. At that time, a lot of the other justices on the court were wearing robes that were representative of, a lot of times, the English court robes. So they were red and white. And after that first court session, the next session, all of the other Supreme Court justices and most of the other state and federal judges throughout the US wore a black robe. We believe this probably signaled an impartiality, and we envisioned that it was equal justice for all. John Marshall's robe, it's the single most significant artifact from his 34-year tenure as Chief Justice, and it defines his legacy of establishing the federal judiciary as a constitutional equal of the president and Congress. Now, this particular robe, you can see here it is, and there it is in the acid-free box. Over the years of just being exposed, it's dyed black with an iron mordant, and that's how it gets that beautiful shade of black. However, the iron mordant that's used when exposed to humidity in the air actually causes a little bit of essentially rust. And so the object itself was deteriorating in front of our eyes. So we employed a conservator named Howard Sutcliffe. He's the principal conservator and director of River Region Costume and Textile Conservations, and it's currently being conserved. Sutcliffe's previous projects include conserving pieces from medieval Egypt, the Tsar Nicholas II's parade uniform, and he's also responsible for restoring the original Kermit the Frog puppet for the Smithsonian. So we expect that the conservation will be completed by the end of the year, and that in March of 2021, we will be able to debut the newly conserved robe at the John Marshall House as part of a special exhibit. Now, this is not an inexpensive process, and though we were able to begin fundraising enough to have it conserved, we are still trying to reach our goal for conservation. And so if you want to know more information about the process that this very important robe is going through to be conserved, we invite you to go to savetherobe.com to learn more, and if so inspired, please donate to that. Now, before John Marshall was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, he was a soldier. And so I'm going to go back a little bit in time and talk about John and Polly. Polly eventually becomes his wife. But so John grows up in the frontier in Fauquier County, kind of in the foothills of the mountains in Virginia. And he leaves the foothills to become a soldier in the American Revolution. And he fights with General Washington at Brandywine. He's part of General Morgan's elite rifle regiment in the Virginia 11th. He spends that very harsh winter at Valley Forge. And it's said that that experience at Valley Forge is what hardened him into one of the nation's leading Federalists. While he was a young rifleman, his fellow soldiers remarked that he was the most cheerful and optimistic man that they knew, and he never complained, and that he was an inexhaustible font of anecdotes. So by 1779, Marshall has been furloughed from the Army, and he treks down to visit his father, who's commanding the State Artillery Regiment in Yorktown. And in anticipation of John's arrival in Yorktown, the Ambler family, who was the treasurer at the time, Jacqueline Ambler is the treasurer, they decided to throw a ball for this very eligible bachelor that's coming to Yorktown. Not to mention the Amblers have 4 daughters. So by the time John gets to Yorktown, the daughters seem to have been expecting something pretty grand from all of the letters that his father was sending. But what they end up finding is somebody who just walked several hundred miles. He was lanky, he was awkward, his clothes didn't fit correctly. And all of the sisters, the Ambler sisters, are taken aback, except for Polly. Now, 14-year-old Polly, she is completely smitten with this 25-year-old war hero. So for the next 6 weeks, John stays in Yorktown, spends all the time he can with the Ambler family, reads some poetry, and then in 1780, he enrolls in William and Mary, and he studies under Chancellor George Wede. Now, here is a photo of Marshall's Commonplace book while he was at William and Mary. And these are the notes that he's written, but you can tell in the upper right-hand corner on the right page and at the bottom of that page where he scribbled Polly Ambler and Polly several times on the page. So you know his mind is drifting. So the relationship continues. The Ambler family moves to Richmond. John follows, starts a law practice in Richmond, continues to court Polly, and eventually they marry. And he, as a young lawyer, they finally raise enough money so that in 1790 they're able to complete the construction of their house. Now, so Polly, while she's vivacious in the beginning of the relationship, her health begins to fail. And by the time that house in Richmond, 1790s, the John Marshall house is completed, she's actually not in the best of health any longer. So the entire time that her and John live in their house on 9th and I Street, she's pretty much reserved from society. It's said that all of her illnesses, which seem to be both mental and physical, just made John more tender towards her. There's plenty of anecdotes about people taking off their shoes to come into the house, and that John Marshall would have to go to the neighbors to quiet the dogs when they would be continuing to bark. And she would leave the city whenever there were parades or festival days. Now, especially because, but not only because of Polly's frail health, the role of slavery in this particular residence was very much taking care of all of the household responsibilities. This is a list from the 1830s of some of the people that were enslaved by John Marshall. By 1830, John Marshall owned about 150 people as slaves. And he'd given a substantial number of enslaved people to his adult children as well. His account books, especially early on, show the purchase of necessary goods like blankets and shoes and clothes for specific enslaved people, and also for services rendered. For example, an enslaved woman would help to bring a baby into this world, and there would be notations about that. But as the years continue, the records continue to trickle off. And by the time we get to the end of Marshall's life, at the time that he's boarding at the Tench-Ringgold's house, it seems that those records are practically non-existent. And so this is the lot on I and 9th Street. And you can see in the bottom right corner is the dwelling house. And to the left is an office. Above on the left is a laundry, and above on the right is a kitchen. And then in the back corner of the lot, you can see a stable. Now, this basically equates to one full city block that John Marshall owned. And so at the house, we often get questions about where were the slave quarters, where did the people who were enslaved sleep? And from what we can tell, each of these structures, the kitchen, the laundry, the stable, seem to be story-and-a-half dwellings. And so it seems very highly likely that the people who were enslaved by John Marshall would have lived in the places where they worked. So above the laundry or kitchen or stable, and also inside of the dwelling house. Now this is a photo of the large dining room inside of John Marshall's home. Now this room, one of the favorite stories that I like to tell in this house, in this particular room, is of the lawyers' dinners that would take place in this room. And so once a month while John Marshall was in town, he would invite the most prominent men in Richmond to dinner once a month. And these multi-courses, 7, 8, 9-course meals that would often go until dawn, with just food and drink and conversation, would take place in this room. All of the courses would be, of course, prepared by the enslaved chef, and all of the service and to the guests would have been done by enslaved help as well. There were a lot of very prominent citizens that would have attended this. We know that Madison Monroe, Lee's, Randolph's, Gouverneur Morris, all were in attendance in this room at some point throughout Marshall's living in this space. And in this room, as with the court in their boarding houses in D.C., absolutely would have been talking about the politics of the day. And John Marshall would have been trying to build consensus over his very famous love of drink, especially Madeira. And these other spaces too, inside the Marshall house, I wanted to point out the back stair hall on the bottom right. And this would have been an area that would have been heavily used by the people who were enslaved in this house. It's the only area in the house that we know wasn't carpeted. And it leads out into that back workyard where the laundry and the office, etc., are located. So this is an area that would have been trafficked by not only the family of the Marshall house, but very heavily by the people who were enslaved at this house. And this is the family dining room. And this is where most of the smaller meals that weren't lawyers' dinners would have taken place. Now, one of the most famous people that were enslaved by John Marshall is a gentleman named Robin Spurlock. And just so you don't get confused, this is actually Robin Spurlock's daughter, Agnes Spurlock. And this is the only image that I know of anybody who was enslaved by John Marshall. So Robin Spurlock was actually a wedding present from Thomas Marshall, John's father, when he marries Polly. And he is a similar age, a few years younger than John, but they basically have grown up together and spend their entire lives together. Robin is, there's a lot of anecdotes and stories about him throughout the time period, throughout John's life, everything from dressing in wonderful yellow stockings to also having the ear of the Chief Justice to bring several cases to John. And so cases like Pleasance v. Pleasance, in which it was a large manumission case. In 1787, there's Hannah v. Davis, which is a case that basically, when decided, it was if somebody can basically, okay. So in Hannah v. Davis, if somebody has an Indian descent on their mother's side, even if their father was enslaved, this law allows them to be born a free person. So it codifies matrilineal descent for the courts. And there's also another case of a woman named Angelica Barnett, where there was a free Black woman in the city of Richmond who'd been accused of murder, and not only John, but also his wife Polly signed a petition to pardon her, and she does eventually. She is pardoned, and so it seems that Robin has a little bit of sway bringing cases like this to John Marshall. But in addition to that, Robin Spurlock in John's will is the only person who is given the opportunity to choose freedom. And so in John Marshall's will, he has the opportunity to either stay enslaved with his choice of John's children, or he could take $50 and he could leave the state of Virginia, as was the law at the time, or he could take $100 and he could leave to go to Liberia. And Liberia is a very interesting, I'll get to that in just a second. So Robin, at that time, John passes away when he is almost 80. And so Robin is in his 70s. And so he does in fact choose to remain enslaved to Mary Marshall, which is John and Polly's daughter. And so he stays in Richmond with Mary Marshall Harvey, and remain and spend all of his remaining years there. I think it's probably pretty clear at that age to leave his family, either to leave the state or to go outside of the country and go to a different continent seem rather outlandish. But John Marshall is the president of the Richmond chapter of the American Colonization Society. And so it makes sense that he would have put that option in there. And so I just wanted to read a quote from John Marshall's time at the Colonization Society to kind of a little bit define his view in 1834. And so it seems that John Marshall developed a growing belief that Blacks would not be treated with equity and justice while living here in the US. On February 8th, 1834, he expresses his hope of a people at present degraded, who must remain degraded while they continue on any part of this continent, forming a free, equal society governed on the humane and liberal principles until it should be capable of governing itself, placed in a situation from which the lights and advantages of Christianity and civilization may be spread over an immense continent. So as the president of the American Colonization Society, it seems that he did have strong feelings about the issue of slavery, and this was his view about how to work on those problems. And so by the time we get to the 1830s, on Christmas Day in 1831, Polly does pass away. And she spends the last about 35 years of her life kind of infirmed and remaining at the Marshall house, or just leaving town when it's too loud in Richmond. And so John writes, on the 3rd of January, 1783, I was united by the holiest bonds to the woman I adored. From the hour of our union to that of our separation, I never ceased to thank heaven for this its best gift. Not a moment passed in which I did not consider her as a blessing from which the chief happiness of my life was derived. Now it's at this time, 1831, that he does go to Tench Ringgold's boarding house to stay with the Supreme Court. He himself was recovering from surgery. He had traveled to Philadelphia to have bladder stones removed surgically by the very famous Dr. Physic. He was also in a carriage accident, and so he's racked with grief from the loss of his wife, and he's also extremely ill at the start of 1831 when he is at what is now the DACOR Bacon House. But it's at that time that he actually talks with Justice Story, and he laments missing his wife, and it is Justice Story at the Tench Ringgold House who is there to comfort the Chief Justice at that time. So continuing on from while he is boarding at the Ringgold House from 1831 to 1833, and he's still sitting on the Supreme Court, and surprisingly, he's also riding the circuit still. So he is presiding over the federal 4th District, as the Supreme Court justices did at that time. So when not on the Supreme Court, he would have either been serving in Richmond, or he would have been going down to Raleigh, North Carolina, 165 miles south of Richmond, in order to sit on that court. So even up until 1833, he's still making that voyage. Some of the more famous cases that come out of his time in the 1830s are two of the cases that make up what's now known as the Marshall Trilogy. And so the Marshall Trilogy are 3 cases that became the foundation of how American Indian law is decided. Now the first one is in 1823, but the other ones are in 1831 and 1832. And so the cases basically involve a series of land transfers. It seems that after the American War of Independence, you have individuals that are selling land or Indians that are selling land to the US government, and also individuals. And so in Johnson and McIntosh, which is the 1823 case, the Supreme Court upholds that the McIntosh family land that was purchased, they don't hold the title because they bought it from the Virginia Indians and not the federal government. And so then in the next case in 1831, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, they asked the Supreme Court to determine whether a state may impose laws on Native Americans on their territory, Georgia, that is. And the court ruled that it didn't have jurisdiction over the case because the Cherokee Nation was a domestic dependent nation instead of a foreign state. And then in 1832, Worcester v. Georgia rules that because the Cherokee Nation was a separate political entity, that it could not be regulated by the states. So it was primarily authored, even though it was at the end of his tenure, by Chief Justice John Marshall, and it basically established the federal primacy in Indian affairs, excluding state laws from Indian country and recognizing tribal governance and authority. And so it also established the place of Indian nations in the American dual sovereign structure, which is basically what we still have today. And so I'll just kind of wrap up with kind of a little, so right before the pandemic struck, we were so fortunate to have had the opportunity to do a program called John Marshall, the Supreme Court and the Trail of Tears. We were able to invite Lindsay Robertson, who you can see on the very left with the red tie. He was one of our keynote speakers. He served on the Supreme Court. He was a Supreme Court justice for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, and works very closely with the American Indian nations. And we also had Principal Chief Chuck Hoskins Jr. of the Cherokee Nation, and that's the gentleman that you see next to Lindsay Robertson. And we had them at the John Marshall House in what was an absolutely amazing event to have Principal Chief Hoskins at John Marshall's house. Just the idea that the trilogy cases kind of came all the way full circle for Chief Hoskins to be at the Marshall House. And so it's events like this that we love to have at John Marshall's home. And we hope to be able to have those kind of events in the very near future once we can gather again at the house. And so that's pretty much the end of my initial presentation. And I look forward to speaking with you again when we do our Q&A. But at this point, I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to let Angela start her presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I'll refer to some of the things you said in my presentation, so it will come full circle and explain some of these things. Again, I'm Angela Dickey. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of DACOR and DACOR Bacon House Foundation. And like Jennifer, I would like to thank the entire team who helped put the presentation together, this program, Jennifer and Mika on Preservation Virginia's side, and Terry Waltz, who is a professional historian who has uncovered a lot of new material about DACOR in the last couple of years, and I will be referring to it in the presentation. And our intern for this semester, Emma Bloom, will be running my slides for me. And there are various other DACOR staff who have helped so much, and I really appreciate them, and they'll be here to help answer any questions that I cannot answer. So Emma, let's go. Again, as Paul said, we are an organization of foreign affairs professionals, and we operate out of what is now called the DACOR Bacon House at 1801 F Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. And this is what the house looks like today. Let's continue. On the side of our house, we have here a marker talking about some of the Supreme Court connections to our house. Those not only include Chief Justice Marshall and Associate Justice Story, who stayed at our house with John Marshall, but there were three others who did as well. Plus, Chief Justice Melville Fuller owned the house between 1895 and 1910. Also, after the original owner, Tench Ringgold, gave up the house, it was owned by William Thomas and Sally Sprigg Carroll. William Carroll was the clerk of the Supreme Court for 35 years, and that family was close friends with the Lincoln family, with President and Mrs. Lincoln. Now, as I said, the house was built by Tench Ringgold, whom you probably never heard before, but he was a real can-do guy. In the early days of Washington, he was a political operative, an entrepreneur, a slave trader, U.S. Marshal, and he had close friends in high places. So let's turn over here, Emma, and look at what the house, some more pictures of the house currently before I go back into that history. This is our garden, and here are some scenes of what our house looks like today. Many of our furnishings belong to the last private owner of the house, Virginia Murray Bacon, who was a renowned civic leader, Republican Party grande dame, and patron of the arts in Washington. And we also have a collection of diplomatic artifacts that you might enjoy seeing. We are in the process now of reviewing our entire collection with a view towards reinterpreting it and making it more relevant for today's time. I wanted to show you here our library, and we have a terrific set of works by and about American diplomats, about our house, some books about John Marshall and the Supreme Court. At the end of the room, you see above the fireplace a portrait of John Marshall. And Emma, if you'll move again to the next slide, we'll see that in more detail. This is a 2008 copy of an 1834 oil on canvas portrait. It was made of Justice Marshall just before he died. In other words, shortly after he would have stayed in our house, in what is now DACOR Bacon House. This original, not this original, but the original from which this copy was made, was painted by John Blennerhassett Martin, an Irish immigrant and resident of Richmond. And the Martin original is owned by the Supreme Court. And on the left, we see an 1850 facsimile silhouette of Marshall in a frock coat and a broad-brimmed hat. The original silhouette was done by Charleston, South Carolina artist William Henry Brown in 1844. Next slide, please. We're also very proud that we have an original set of original 5-volume biography written by John Marshall of George Washington. You may not know this, but John Marshall wrote this biography at the request of Bushrod Washington. Bushrod sat on the Supreme Court when Marshall was Chief Justice. The two were lifelong friends, and they had started out their careers taking that same law course at William and Mary when they were young men. Next slide. Now, this is where we get into some territory that many people probably are not aware of, and that is that early politicians and bureaucrats in Washington tended to live in boarding houses. And John Marshall and the Supreme Court were no exception. And many of our Supreme Court traditions began in boarding houses. John Marshall established the custom of living with his justices in a boarding house right at the beginning. They would convene at a boarding house every winter. The Supreme Court met from January to March in the winters back then. Nobody lived permanently in Washington. It was a brand new town. There were very few real residences built of brick. So this is Conrad and McMunn's boarding house. Let's see. Joel R. Paul has written a new biography of Marshall and refers to this. When Marshall came to Washington in 1801, he arranged for the justices to live together as boarders at Conrad and McMunn's boarding house. They were to be charged $15 a week to cover candles, firewood, and wine. That was a pretty good deal, I'd say. And I like this story. Space had become available at this particular boarding house because Thomas Jefferson and his crowd had been living in it. But Thomas Jefferson was elected president. So he and his entourage moved out of this boarding house and into the president's house. And John Marshall and his entourage moved into the boarding house. Now, it was both a necessity and a personal preference of Marshall that everybody roomed together in the same place. First of all, as I said, they didn't have any residences and they didn't really have a place to meet. So they would stay in the boarding houses. Marshall wanted to encourage congeniality. The justices were from different parts of the country. And Marshall also wanted to forge a common view. And Jennifer referred to the fact that Marshall was a strong Federalist. And as a Federalist, he was loyal to the ideals of Washington. And he was alarmed by what he thought were the destabilizing tendencies of Thomas Jefferson, his third cousin, once removed, and Jefferson's allies. And he wanted to ensure that the Supreme Court would contribute to a strong central government. Recall that Jefferson, on the other hand, was very suspicious of courts, and he did not want the Supreme Court to be any more powerful than it was at the time, which it wasn't. So the Jeffersonians had just come into power, both in the White House and in the Congress, and Marshall comes in and is going to create a new kind of Supreme Court by having everybody live together, eat together, discusses the case together, drink wine together, and then go off and sleep together in the same house and think about it. So the custom began, and for the next 29, 30 years, it continues. And so we go along for 29 or 30 years. And in 1831, the 7 justices of the court had taken rooms at thought they were going to stay at Ms. Peyton's boarding house, but that did not transpire. So finally, it was fixed that they would go and stay at Tench Ringgold's house, which was a bit further away. It wasn't on Capitol Hill. It was at the other end of town on the other side of the White House. So now let's go to the next 3 slides here. This is a slide of a new painting that was done in the last few years by Peter Wede, showing Washington City in 1825 from across the river in Virginia. You can barely see the Capitol kind of on the right peninsula, and the White House sort of to the left above the lady in a red dress. Next slide, please. Here's a close-up. In this part of the picture, we see the White House clearly in the middle, and then if you look down to the left, sort of to the southwest, you see a small white circle around a red brick building, and that is Tench Ringgold's brick house. Now, why did Marshall choose Tench Ringgold's house? It was clearly very far away from the office of the Supreme Court, which was in the Capitol building. In this picture, you see the line that the justices would have had to take. And recall, this would have been a dirt road, and you would have had to go by horseback or carriage or coach the 2 miles between Ringgold's place and the Capitol. So you would take a circuitous road around the White House and then down Pennsylvania Avenue. So this was 2 miles. It's a pretty long hike before cars. Now, why did they do this? Well, Chief Justice Marshall and Tench Ringgold knew each other because they worked in the court and on Capitol Hill together. You have to think of Ringgold sort of like being the equivalent of, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 bureaucrats today. He's running around in the Capitol and as the U.S. Marshal and doing all kinds of things, including giving out the keys to new officials who need offices. And so if you were a new official on the Supreme Court, you would go to Ringgold to get your key to your place. And also, Ringgold and Marshall would work together every 4 years on the inauguration preparations and the ceremony. As you know, the Supreme Court Chief Justice administers the oath of office to the new president. Well, it was Tench Ringgold who would make all the arrangements behind the scenes, again, doing what an army of bureaucrats do today. But Ringgold had lost his official position in 1831 when Andrew Jackson, the new president, refused to renew him. So by 1831 and 1832, Tench Ringgold is starting to get into financial trouble. And so Marshall, we think now that Marshall was probably trying to help out his old friend and acquaintance, Tench Ringgold. And in fact, we know that Ringgold and Story, quote, condoled Ringgold. In other words, consoled him when he was in a very bad mood and very sad about the state of his personal finances. So let's go to the next slides. We're going to go through a few slides showing what Washington, D.C. would have looked like during this era. I really like this picture of the cow in the road. Next picture. Perhaps John Marshall and the justices would have seen scenes like this as they walked or rode in a carriage from Ringgold's to the Capitol. Next. And here is a picture of the restored Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol building, which is where they met prior to 1814, when the building was burned by the British during the War of 1812. And then later on, they would have resumed having court in this room when the Capitol was redone. Let's see. All right. Excuse me, let me find my place in my notes. All right, before I get to the justices who stayed there, before Ringgold moved in, we have some indication of before Marshall moved in, excuse me, we have some indication of how Ringgold was preparing for his guests. His old friend and former president, James Monroe, sent a cartload of food from his plantation at Oak Hill in Loudoun County with one of his enslaved workers. The delivery consisted of, quote, 16 turkeys, 9 geese, 34 pounds of butter, 16 hams weighing 140 pounds. And that's according to Monroe's overseer. Also, to assist Ringgold in taking care of these prominent guests, he could rely on his staff of 10 or more enslaved house workers, including a woman named Betsy and Betsy's daughter, Ellen, who was about 10. In the last couple of years, Terry has done a lot of research and turned up new information about the enslaved people at Ringgold's house, and also the people enslaved by the Carroll family, the next owners of the house. And we are consciously trying to center the voices of these people who would not have been heard of before in stories about John Marshall or anyone else. Here are the 5 justices who came to stay at Ringgold's house. Marshall, we have Joseph Story again, who was a Madison appointee, Smith Thompson from New York, a Monroe appointee, Gabriel Duval from Maryland, a Madison appointee, and Henry Baldwin from Connecticut, a Jackson appointee. Now, in the 1832 term, John McLean, a Jackson appointee from Ohio, did not stay with the team, and Justice William Johnson from South Carolina was sick, so he did not show up at all for that term. But I find it very interesting that all these people who were appointed by different presidents were able to still live together in good company in the same house, not just with themselves, but with 20 other people in a 2-story Washington federal home. So that's pretty crowded for that size of a house. It's also interesting that Johnson, who was appointed by Jefferson, regularly reported that, or he reported later, that President Jefferson regularly urged him to break consensus with Marshall. Now, as we've indicated before, it was important for Marshall to reach consensus, and he introduced the rule, the consensus rule, because prior to Marshall, we had a situation where Supreme Court justices issued individual opinions, which is called ad seriatim. And that's also now a hybrid of which we do have today when we have dissents. But during Marshall's rule, there were very few dissents. And Marshall himself dissented in only 3 cases over a 30-year career. Next picture, please. Here is a picture drawn by a congressman of another boarding house setup where some congresspersons lived, a nearby boarding house. And the congressman has drawn where everyone is sitting at the dinner table. So we can imagine that something like this must have been happening in Ringgold's house with the justices and others sitting around that table. So the practice of dining together was important to Marshall. He thought it was extremely important for developing good relations with people. Jennifer's already alluded to that, about how we like to entertain in the Richmond house. So in today's Supreme Court, the justices still eat lunch together, even if they do not live together. And I would note that Chief Justice Melvin Fuller, who owned our house from 1895 to 1910, explicitly followed Marshall's example by inviting the justices on his court to dinner at the residence each Saturday. And Fuller also resurrected Marshall's habit of discussing the cases after dinner over wine in the house. Now let's go to 3 black and white pictures here. Okay, so these pictures were taken, I think, in the 70s, but they sort of give you an idea of some things. This is, on the left is the landing as you come up the stairs to the entertainment rooms. We think that the original entryway may have been at the far end where that bay window is now. In the middle is the fireplace in the south drawing room. This is the room in which John Marshall would have held court, so to speak. And on the right, we have the original stairway still there now, which would have led, and still does, lead up to the 3rd floor where the bedrooms would have been back in Marshall's time. Let's go ahead, Emma. This is a picture of what we call the Mews today. It looks still exactly like this. On the right side is the original stable. The interior has been totally reconstructed into an office. But this is where Tench Ringgold would have kept his coaches and horses, and where some of his enslaved people might have stayed. And perhaps if an enslaved person came with Marshall from Richmond, that person might have stayed here as well. We know that when the weather was inclement, they would have had to take the coach to the Supreme Court due to the fact that, you know, we don't have the nice sidewalks that we do today in Washington, D.C. All right, go right ahead, Emma, to this is Worcester versus Georgia, one of the 3 the Native American cases discussed by Jennifer. And these are Marshall's handwritten notes. So during 1832, this was the major case, and they would have discussed it in the Ringgold house where they were living. Again, it was the point of the case was to define the rights of the Cherokee Nation, which had its own treaties. And the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional a Georgia law that conflicted with the federal treaty. And of course, the states' rights people were extremely upset by this, and Andrew Jackson was enraged and is said to have shouted, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And we know that this didn't end well for the Cherokees. So the term concluded that year, and then the next year, Marshall and Story came back and stayed in the house. The rest of the justices went elsewhere, however. But still, the court remained remarkably unanimous. The justices heard 41 cases and only 1 was not unanimous. How could this be? Meanwhile, Tench Ringgold is in a world of financial hurt, and the house has to be sold off so that he can pay his debts, and he has to move out, and he moved to what's now Arlington County, and he wrote to Marshall that he could not put him up for the next term. So Marshall was very surprised by this, But he and Story, who are now very close friends, they were best friends, it appears, for most of their lives, even though Marshall was he was a generation ahead of Story, maybe 20 years older. They just agreed to stay at Mrs. Dunn's boarding house, which is up on Capitol Hill. It's on A Street between North Capitol and First Streets, and it was much closer to the Capitol than Ringgold's house. Let's go on, Emma. So I'll conclude now with this part of the story. Here's what we think the Ringgold house would have looked like when John Marshall stayed there. And I'll conclude with this quote from the New York Times, a 2014 editorial. It took Chief Justice John Marshall's leadership at the start of the 19th century to bring the court together and to establish the practice of writing a single opinion for the court. Marshall was not above using hard and soft persuasion, going so far as to invite his colleagues to live together in a Washington boarding house, where they bonded and discussed cases over Madeira. Disagreement on the court in that century was rare, with dissents occurring only roughly 10% of the time. Okay. Paul has already told you what we do currently in DACOR House. We're basically a foreign affairs organization, so we're devoted to the diplomatic profession. And then we're devoted to preserving this wonderful house with all its Supreme Court connections. And let's see this last slide here, Emma. No, keep going. Again, this is the South Drawing Room today, and this is the one where the Marshall Court would have met with Madeira. The painting on the right is of the last royal governor of Virginia, Mr. Murray, who was the ancestor of the last private owner of the house, Mrs. Bacon. And then we have one more picture, I believe. A few years ago, my hero and the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg visited DACOR following swearing in a U.S. ambassador at the State Department. And she's here standing in front of several Marshall mementos. You see once again, the 1850 facsimile silhouette, and you see a color photo engraving of Marshall in profile. It was copied in 1901 from an 1808 crayon on pink paper by Charles Saint-Mamin, and it's it is the copy of one of the 9 photo engravings that were commissioned by President Theodore Roosevelt to give as Christmas presents to the entire court, Melville Fuller's court, in 1901. Again, Melville Fuller would have been living in the house and received his portrait there, but we think ours is the one that was given to Associate Justice Horace Gray. And you have one of these at your house, Jennifer, or at John Marshall's house. So I thank you and welcome your questions.
Excellent, and welcome back everyone. And thank you to our speakers for their wonderful presentations. We do have some questions in the time remaining, and I do want to ask one from the chat. So to all of our speakers, what ongoing relationships does the DACOR Bacon House and the John Marshall House have with the Supreme Court? Feel free to address as you like.
Well, I'll go ahead and speak a little bit to the relationship that Preservation Virginia and the John Marshall House have. The Supreme Court Historical Foundation has been, they work very closely with us from a collections and curatorial standpoint. Everything from visits to see some of the amazing book collections that we have at the Marshall House. We have a remarkable number of books that belong to the Chief Justice or his children, or in some cases, the many descendants that are also named John Marshall. And so we recently had a visit from the curator from the Supreme Court Historical Society to compare all of the different signatures in our books. But we've also done docent training where our interpreters from the Marshall House will go up to the Supreme Court, and the interpreters from the Supreme Court will come down to the Marshall House and take tours. I have to say that the Supreme Court Historical Society has been most gracious. Every time we've ever gone up to the Supreme Court, they have pulled objects from their collection to show us relating to John Marshall, and it's an amazing experience. They were also one of the first donors to the Save the Road project in support of the conservation of John Marshall's Road.
Well, if you want me to answer that question too, for DACOR, the Supreme Court Historical Society has a unique role, which is the executive director of that society is an ex officio member of the DACOR Bacon House Foundation board, and was explicitly made so through the efforts of the last private owner, Mrs. Virginia Bacon, who was very much taken with the Supreme Court history of her house. And she wanted to perpetuate the history, so she left an easement for the exterior of her house to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And through the foundation that she left, that evolved into DACOR Bacon House Foundation, she ensured that the Supreme Court would remain interested through the position of having someone on our board as an ex officio member. And we are trying to upgrade those ties. We realize that going forward in our desire to highlight our house and its historical connections, and to be able to raise funds in order to keep the preservation going, that we need to nurture that relationship more, and we intend to do that.
Excellent. So Terry, we have a question for you in the chat. One of our audience members is interested to know about your new research regarding the enslaved individuals who lived at the DACOR Bacon House.
Well, it's been really an interesting journey to find out who they were. It's not as though there are no, first of all, the builder of the house, Ringgold, left no personal papers that we have had access to or know about, as opposed to many other slave owners, including John Marshall, who at least made a list of the people who were living in the house. But he was a businessman, and he owned a plantation up in Washington County, Maryland, and that's where his base was. And when he started out in Washington, he moved down to Georgetown and began business. He needed some cash. And so he started mortgaging his slaves. And in one of the documents in the Washington District of Columbia archives, I found was the mortgage document of the slaves. Was for a loan, a line of credit at one of the banks of Washington. He actually lists the names of the slaves that he is mortgaging, which is the first clue that we have of individuals who were probably working at DACOR House. Later, the other important record about recovering the names of the slaves is many of the emancipation documents that were filed in 1862 when Congress decided that the slave population of Washington would be emancipated and the owners would be compensated. And in order to get compensation, they had to file petitions which listed their names, their occupations, and sometimes where they came from, and what they were, what kinds of, what their worth was, an estimate of what their worth was. And those various kinds of clues have allowed me to reconstruct probably the list of the enslaved workers who worked in Ringgold's house and later in Thomas Carroll's house, which is DACOR Bacon House.
Excellent, thank you very much. Jen, do you have anything else to add about any enslaved populations at John Marshall House and the enslaved valets that we had there?
Sure.
Well, as far as we can guess, they would have been at Ringgold House. They would have been essentially making it comfortable for the justices to live there, and that meant providing food. Seeing that their rooms were warmed. They had to bring wood in for the fireplaces. All of the rooms had fireplaces. They probably saw that the justices were carried off in their coaches to to the Supreme Court, which was 2 miles away, if they didn't walk. And some of them were so old that they probably couldn't make the distance without getting a ride. So they made, they would have been responsible for making life bearable and perhaps enjoyable by serving the Madeira wine that they were so fond of imbibing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Terry, very much. And Jen, is there anything else to say about the enslaved valets at the Marshall House?
Sure. So we have a couple of notes and letters of names of individuals that we know were traveling with John Marshall at different times. And so there's mentions of enslaved men named an enslaved man named Dick who traveled with John Marshall up to Philadelphia. And also it seems that there's a really great story, and it's one of the letters that we have that comes from 1803 when John Marshall was traveling down to Raleigh, and apparently he was bringing an enslaved valet named Peter along with him. And it's one of the very few instances that we know of where John Marshall specifically named somebody in a letter back home. But what ended up happening is in this fateful 165-mile travel from Richmond to Raleigh, he apparently, there's a hole in his pocket and he loses all the money that he was carrying with him. And then when he arrives in Raleigh, he realizes, and in his letter, he seems to blame Peter for this, for not packing his pants. And so he goes all around town and tries to find somebody who can either sell him or make him a pair of pants. But he realizes that while he thought he was only not going to be able to wear pants for one day, he's going to have to go sans culotte for the entire term, as he puts it. And so John Marshall's pantsless on the court for an entire term. But we know that Peter came along with him. And it seems later on in his life, there was a man named Obi who travels quite a lot with the justice in the 1820s. But again, the information for the very latter years, the 1830s, seems non-existent from what I have found at this point.
Excellent, thank you. We have.
But if I could
yes,
just
please.
add, it seems likely that Marshall would have brought someone with him from Richmond in 1832 when he came up for the court term, because, as you pointed out, he was ill and grieving. So, and it's unlikely that he would have ridden horseback that distance, although he was accustomed to riding horseback long distances. It's probably that he brought a carriage, but if that were the case, then he would have had to have brought somebody to help him.
Yeah, no doubt.
That seems it seems extremely likely. I have no doubt that there are letters somewhere or some sort of accounts that tell us. So if anybody out there has them, let us know.
I believe we have time for one more question before closing remarks. And I'm curious to know from all of our panelists what you believe Marshall's most enduring legacy is, whether it's a court decision he made, whether it was implementing the black robe on the court, what you all might think is one of his most enduring legacies.
Jennifer, do you want to take it? Or do you want me to?
No, I mean, you're on the screen now. Why don't you go ahead and take it, and then maybe I'll say something at the end.
Well, I think there's a reason that when people talk about John Marshall, they call him the greatest Chief Justice. I mean, he set the tone. He set the tone for the next 100 years, or we could say he set the Supreme Court on a course that has not been deviated from in 200 years, which is it is a strong and equal partner with the other two branches, which certainly was not the case when he joined it. It was in 1800, the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction over anything. It was extremely weak. John Jay, the Chief Justice, didn't want the job. Several people turned the job down. So it was up to Marshall to make something of the court, to make it into something that would help the country and help unify the country. Of course, what he tried to do was very controversial. What the Supreme Court has done has always been controversial. But nevertheless, we have now 3 equal branches of government. And I think we owe a lot of that to the personal leadership of John Marshall.
Angela, I couldn't agree more. I really think that there were several opportunities in which John Marshall did not, his rulings, for example, like the Marbury v. Madison case, his rulings basically said this isn't the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, kicking it back down. And there seems to be a lot of cases in which John Marshall defines the role of the Supreme Court as the arbitrator of the Constitution. And that gives the power of that third branch as the judicial co-equal branch to the executive and the legislative branch. I think that I would be remiss if we didn't also mention that John Marshall is the oldest of 15 children. And that they grew up, in the country in essentially just above a log cabin. And when you think about having to manage all of those siblings, and then when we talk about managing these dinners that he had at his house, and then having everybody stay in the boarding houses together, and the amount of consensus that John Marshall created, I have to think that had to do with being the oldest brother. So I think that he just had a natural knack for getting people together, and for understanding one's role. And so I think that leads back to him defining the Constitution, defining the judicial branch.
Excellent. And our very last question for the program, several are interested to know where the McMunn and Conrad House is located and when it was demolished. I might defer to Angela for that.
I think I would have to defer to Terry for that. It's no longer there. Terry, do you know?
I don't know when it was demolished because I think it was on something like A and First Street, but I won't swear to it. I can certainly find out if anybody would like to contact us, or I can send it to Jennifer and she can know where it was.
Okay, excellent. Jen, we want to finish up with some closing remarks from you and Angela.
Absolutely. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in. It was an honor to speak before the folks that are affiliated specifically with the DACOR Bacon House and tell them all about the John Marshall House here in Richmond. And for those of us who are familiar with Preservation, Virginia, we're so glad that you're continuing to tune into our programming. So thank you so much. I'd like to say that the John Marshall House is open to the public once again after being closed for a time due to COVID concerns. And so we're open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We have an online ticketing system, and Mika has a group of amazing interpreters. So we hope that you will have the chance to come down to Richmond or come up wherever you're coming from, and actually visit the house in person. And also, let us not forget that March 2021, we're going to have a remarkable exhibit where the robes are going to be back on display. So thank you once again. And the one last thing that I want to say is that after this program, within the next day or two, you'll be getting a follow-up survey. And we really do hope that you will take the time to fill out this short survey so that we can make sure that we tailor future programs to the things that you like, the things that you want to hear about, and to give us some feedback as to what you liked and didn't like. And also, like Mika mentioned, this program is currently being recorded, and so in the very near future, we'll have links to it, and you'll be able to share it with anybody that you would like, or replay it, whatever you would like to do. So thank you all so much. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, everyone. I don't have anything really to add other than this has been a lot of fun, and I hope that we do this again and that our collaboration grows deeper with Preservation Virginia, because I think we have many shared values and interests here. And so thank you so much, and long live John Marshall and John Marshall House and Preservation Virginia.